Hey everyone, so I'm back from my focus and my sprint on writing the book, which is now in the proofreading phase and soon to be back with my publisher, so I'm very happy about that. It's called Insufficient Rewards, and realistically it's still probably about 11 months from being a physical object, hopefully on your shelves, so I'll let you know as that gets closer. And then as a surprise bonus even to myself, I've also started cracking away on a fiction book, which is surprisingly about a lot of the same philosophical ideas of identity and morality and history and memory and all that good stuff. Very much in my style, very Vonnegut-esque. It's just kind of coming out of me. So anyway, exciting stuff there that I'll keep you updated on, but I'll put it aside because I'm ready to jump back into the conversation here. I've been paying attention, and I want to tell you a bit about where my focus has been and I think will be in the near term, and then to tell you about 5 tremendous guests that I have lined up. And then the bulk of this video is an essay which is adapted from something I added recently, actually, to the book, which is called Insufficient Rewards. So I'm sensing a bit of an opportunity in the global conversation. I'm sure you are too. It might be a really, really big one. I'm sure you've been seeing more and more people who might have been kind of in the MAGA circles, of America First, who are running headfirst into what sure looks a lot like Israel first, and they're scratching their heads or getting a little pretty, miffed about the whole thing. I'm talking about people like Candace Owens, Dave Smith, maybe Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, of course, Tim Dillon, Theo Vaughn, whoever. I'm sure there's others out there that you could think of who've been involved. I'd really love to interact with some of them directly at some point if I can, because I think there's something really important in this little mental traffic jam that we're seeing, and potentially dangerous too. So, maybe there's some unsavory kind of conspiracy theories that you could go when you reach this point, and I'll touch on that in the essay. But generally, I think what we're seeing is a really good thing, this clash, and it has a lot of people reassessing the world and maybe how it functions and how power works. And generally just kind of what explanatory frameworks help us understand and predict the world. And I think that the first step out of a kind of hypnosis or mythology is good. Any step out of mythology is good. That kind of what the heck is going on here, those questions. But I do think there are necessary next steps to take further. What I mean is that I really want to understand what we mean and want for people to understand when Israel says something like, we are fighting your wars for you, or, they're pointing to the US and the EU, of course, they're not lying exactly. And they're not just talking about so-called, enemies of civilization or something. That's really what I'll be breaking down in this particular essay. But no, like for these commentators that I mentioned, when they see Israel first and America first and they think there's a clash, I do think there's not as much of a clash as they are thinking that there is. But to understand that, you have to go a bit deeper. I mean, I think a lot of these commentators maybe had a kind of romantic idea in mythology of something like America and what America first would mean, maybe as a kind of nation like all the other nations, which should just be concerned about its own borders and internal affairs, or at least primarily concerned with those things. And, generally be responsive and reflective of the desires and concerns and aspirations of its own people. And, they just can't quite wrap their heads around why this little country over there in the Middle East seems to take so much precedence. And I think the next steps for some of these folks needs to be an analysis which must understand America and its behavior in terms of empire, for lack of a better word, and then the mechanics of it, the specific mechanics and relationships of how all that stuff works. And honestly, for some of these commentators, or maybe friends of yours, or maybe yourself, if you're having these thoughts, this is a pretty foreign type of analysis, since it's generally really a leftist one. But I really am eager for some of these people to try it on for size. And to do that, I think it's going to be necessary for us to carefully upgrade our understanding and knowledge of, again, specific mechanisms of empire. And I think this is the way, you can and should avoid the pitfalls of maybe conspiracy theory thinking or rampant speculation, kind of crazy theories which can drift further away from the solid explanatory frameworks of the world that we're all searching for. I mean, I'm really talking about things like currency systems and economics and energy policy and whatnot. things that can be a bit complicated, but not impossibly complex. I'm talking about something like understanding what the petrodollar system is, and the Nixon shock, and the aftermath of the OPEC 1973 oil strike, how inflation operates in a fiat system where the global reserve currency is a fiat American dollar. And now, of course, the potential BRICS challenge to it. Now, a lot of those terms that I just floated, for some reason, get associated with conspiracy theory thinking. I think there's reasons for that. And, immediately get you kind of side-eyed by certain people. And I've done shows on this before, but I just want to remind my audience before this full essay of just how sensitive I am to that stuff, how careful I think we do have to be when, we start to doubt the official story or whatever, or you look for deeper motivations than the stated ones. And I've lost friends, like literally to suicide, to some of those paths, perhaps if they lost their footing and grips on reality. But I'll just remind people as we tiptoe through these things that my kind of central statement and kind of, centering intention, as it were, to come back to is always this one. Once you have located who benefits from a world event or power structure or whatever, you have not necessarily discovered who orchestrated or coordinated or engineered that event. That's the drift from sort of simple systems and political and economic and moral analysis and psychological incentives and all that kind of really mundane, non-controversial critique over to potential conspiracy and whatnot. And while conspiracy happens, of course, it's a pretty flimsy word that I think can just sort of mean, an arrangement between two or more people to hide the true intentions and motivations, either big or small, that, kind of stem from incentive to sinister conspiracy. It's usually that step not necessary. And sometimes it can be distracting from the much more obvious problems. Anyway, I think some of the names I mentioned, particularly I'm thinking of Tucker Carlson, has been sort of a fascinating case to watch. It's quite interesting to see him do this in public, or at least what we see on YouTube, where, a rather conservative psychology is seemingly now discovering perhaps the geopolitics of something like American foreign policy and what's really driving things, and kind of having his mind blown by what might have been the underlying, motivations behind the rhetoric to sell a war or support certain leaders or coups or whatever. So I think if your first step into this conversation, this better conversation, I think, was a clash between America first and Israel first, either brought on by maybe just a moral breaking point, or maybe a political one, a philosophical one that's more concerned about, your own job prospects or tax bill or whatever, great, fine, that's all fine. There's a lot of ways into this conversation. And after that first step, I think it could kind of go, let's say, one of three ways. One is maybe an anti-Semitic rabbit hole of Israel or Jews manipulating the world in order to, conquer it or do some sinister antichrist stuff, whatever. And you start, pulling in stuff about satanic rituals or whatever. Let's not do that one. You don't have to do that one. It's totally unnecessary. Or another way, once you have this clash, is you can go down a mental direction of Israel just being maybe on the front lines of a real fight against barbaric terrorism or some ideological association and friendship with something like the West or America or freedom-loving open societies or countries or whatever, and that, we just have to help out with their fight in a kind of, win of a clash of civilizations and a battle of ideas, and they're on the front line of this thing. That's particularly the mental path that I'm going to be challenging directly in this essay. This Israel first, America first clash can get more people into the discussion that maybe America, though, is not an entity that's exactly what you thought it was. Maybe America is better thought of as something like the caretaker or crafter or maybe leader of a kind of empire built on all kinds of militaristic and economic systems and relationships that have understandable mechanisms of control and manipulation, and really does need a thorough examination, morally and politically, etc., about just how benevolent this empire is. And the interesting thing for me is to see how many of these frustrated or, let's say, disillusioned MAGA folks might actually step closer to that kind of anti-colonialist or anti-imperialist analysis. I really wonder how many will get there. And of course, I think another major on-ramp or off-ramp, whatever you're thinking is the analogy there, is the Epstein cover-up and all the madness that's happening there. It's a potential major entry point for the same conversation, right? I mean, a really big one with the flood happening right now, because that cover-up could very well be in the service of maintaining certain mechanisms and operations and myths of this empire, even if you are sure it's benevolent. Which perhaps when all is said and done in the analysis will cleave the crowd into, those who buy in to the moral argument in favor of empire as a kind of necessary global leviathan versus those who challenge it and are just out on the very idea of it. So I don't know, but these times we're in are making some strange bedfellows, anti-war libertarians, disillusioned and frustrated would-be MAGA isolationists, anti-imperialist leftists, nostalgic anarchists, and of course just some infected with Trump derangement syndrome who will do anything to just bury that dude. And the same could be said, of course, for Democrat derangement syndrome, who would like nothing more than to see, Clinton or Pelosi or whoever just morally stained forever. It's an interesting party to be at right now, and I hope I can help us make some sense of all of it. So my next 5 guests actually lined up in August and into September are Scott Horton, who had one of these really interesting conversations with Tucker Carlson that's worth watching, actually. It's all about American foreign policy in the Middle East and Iran and Iraq and Kuwait. And he's a fantastic researcher and author on a ton of covert stuff that went on there. So I'm talking to him this week and really excited about that opportunity. He's more of the anti-war libertarian camp. Then Radhika Desai, who is going to talk all about BRICS and her enthusiasm for sort of a new system to challenge U.S. dollar dominance and hegemonic sort of power. Then Patrick Bond, who shares her fierce critique of American hegemonic power, but is much more skeptical that BRICS maybe is anything other than just a neoliberal dragon which we're going to have to slay later. And Adam Hanieh, who provides an incredibly good analysis of petrochemicals in the Middle East and how they fit into the whole picture, and the still underappreciated role of oil as a machine for the kind of capitalism that we have come to know it as. And he also has an interesting story. His father, he's Palestinian, and his father was in Palestine in 1948 as a teenager. So then I'm also going to bring back Dirk Moses to speak with me again. I had him on before to discuss the problems of genocide, but this time we're going to be focusing a bit more on the language of transgression, which is all about how weaponized and propagandized language becomes when it's needed to maybe make and dehumanize an enemy. So it's a really, really good lineup, and it reflects, I think, my efforts to try to nudge the global conversation towards analysis of empire and economic control, and a bit away from the direct horrors and moral nightmare of something like Gaza itself. And of course, that is not to say or suggest that in any way that it has become less of a nightmare. The nightmare, of course, only deepens there every day. And sadly, I think will probably grow darker and more horrible and more depraved. But I just think on the specific effort of trying to, beat the drum louder on just how depraved and ugly and immoral the actions are, or just how obvious the crimes are at this point, has basically already split the world just about as much as it's going to psychologically. I mean, there might be a few more people who just need to see a little more bloodshed or intentional starvation before they ask these deeper questions. But likely, if they do get there, they're just going to sort of say, okay, I agree, they've gone too far, which is not really the kind of response and step I'm interested in. I'm interested in questions and responses of people who really want to step back and wonder, what's really going on at a deeper level. Not just that maybe Israel got a little carried away or the collateral damage is too much to bear at this point. I'm looking for a deeper structural questioning of things at the level of incentives and motivations and intentions. And again, the mechanisms of control and empire. So I will say, though, that entry point of just being horrified because the killing and murder is just too much is not to be scoffed off. It's great if people get there. That entry, or exit point, depending on the way you're working the analogy, is great. I'm thinking now of Glenn Loury, for example, who seemed to reach that breaking point in the middle of one of his regular conversations with John McWhorter, when he basically, exclaimed a question to John of, do they have to kill them all, John? Do they have to kill them all? And then it was kind of quiet. I thought it was a pretty powerful moment, and very human, actually. And then Glenn Loury, who's conservative, went on to have a really interesting conversation with Tucker Carlson, which I thought he displayed a really admirable amount of humility and self-analysis that perhaps maybe he, as a conservative-minded person, has been a bit too naturally trusting, maybe, of what his government tells him, and his worldview is a little bit cracked and falling apart. He's just not sure he could take the moral horror anymore, and that this is just, some necessary bloodshed. He just can't take it anymore. Or maybe he's seeing the cracks in, the always noble and freedom-loving, professed intentions of the West. I'm not really sure. Anyway, I thought it was a really interesting conversation. And again, a potential opening to these waters where I wish more of us would swim. But generally, the horror of the world has either pushed you to a breaking point or it just won't. And as just one more final update before the essay, I have some maybe disappointing news from some people who commented about my mom. I thought she was ready and able to take the step of having this conversation a bit openly, but alas, I apologize. I now highly doubt that it's ever going to happen. So for myself and everyone else, let's set that aside as an open wound that might never be healed, and I hope it's not indicative of a larger population. She's full on head in the sand, and I think that's where she at least says she's satisfied staying. So for those asking about her, I just don't think it's going to happen. I think, let's say, this next decade is actually going to be really tough for a lot of people. I could mean that in several ways that are plainly horrifying and obvious, but I mean that in a way that I think it's going to be really tough for people who really have a lot of trouble living in an ambiguous world. Worlds without clear-cut truths or authorities who you can trust to tell you the truth, or that if they conceal or hide the truth from you, you could trust that their intentions are still good and noble or caring. Worlds where right and wrong are not grounded in something objectively, maybe scientifically provable or whatever. Worlds where you can't just kind of, follow the crowd and conform to the comfortable dominant norms of your time and be confident that you're a good person while doing so. Those kinds of ambiguous worlds are really difficult to inhabit for some people. And I'll say for all people, really. I'm not trying to be smug or holier than thou about that. This is something that Simone de Beauvoir wrote about in a book called The Ethics of Ambiguity. It's kind of a universal discomfort. I think, when the narratives and myths and access to truth or whatever, if it starts to crack and it's a myth that has shielded you from this ambiguous reality and that discomfort, some people really have a lot of trouble. I mean, you could say this is a kind of religious orientation, sure. I mean, analogizing God himself as a kind of authority which might hide some deeper truths from you, but you must trust and have faith that his intentions are loving and good, is certainly a pretty good description of many religious traditions and conceptions of God, which serve to cradle you in kind of a blanket of love and protect you from the ambiguity out there. But the atheistic orientation can work in precisely the same way, but just with a faith and trust in the ultimate benevolence of systems and structures of various forms of authority which serve the same purpose. And I think that's the side of the story that's really suffering a crisis of confidence, or will continue to do so in a major way in the next decade. And some people are really going to have a hard time, a massively difficult time with it, as they lose their footing in this world. So, with that said, I'm going to try to be a voice in that process and tread carefully through it now in the essay that I want to focus on, which is all about kind of the attraction to a very particularly common worldview that springs from this fear of discovering that we're in an ambiguous world, which this worldview casts everything as a battle of ideas or a clash of civilizations, that kind of framework. There's people stuck in that worldview who are probably sure that I've gone off the rails and think that understanding the incentives and demands of something like the petrodollar system and how it nearly ensures environmental degradation and seeds the resentment for anti-neo-colonial revolutionary movements, which will inevitably be religious-minded, is all just completely unnecessary and besides the point, and I'm out of my mind. So let's see. I think the central specific question that I wish these kinds of people would answer is something like this. And if you're in contact with them, see if you can get them to actually answer this. Can you explain, this is the question, can you explain in what ways a genuinely liberated and peaceful and non-threatening Palestine or Iran or Saudi Arabia or Ghana or Uganda for that matter, but pick one of them, is a problem? A genuinely liberated Saudi Arabia is a problem to the wealth and stability of the American dollar and the maintenance of the global north. I mean, how is a genuinely liberated and free Iran a threat to the West? And of course, the really awesome embedded question in there is, what is genuine liberation on a cultural, national, and individual level? And if they can't understand or even articulate the ways in which something like a hypothetical, democratic, completely secular, let's say gender-inclusive and equality-focused and self-interested political revolution, interested in maybe renegotiating the contracts of its own resources and redirecting their profits and outputs towards their own working-class population in some egalitarian way, right? I'm trying to get rid of the response of, well, if they were liberated, they would just bomb everyone and be a big problem because, they're hell-bent on jihad or whatever. Get rid of that. Say that problem would magically be fixed and all of those ideas would be non-existent. So imagine this kind of transformation in a place like Saudi Arabia, for example. How is that a threat to the systems which are fueling and floating the debt and interest and dollar inflation economy and status of the American-led empire? If they can't even articulate any of that, how a genuine liberated Middle East is a threat, with any kind of clear-minded analysis, then they are just woefully inadequate and very likely unhelpful. Or they've become an unwitting tool of the status quo, which simply can't comprehend the hypothetical and likely have very little interest in the historical record, which would make the hypothetical not so hypothetical, which I'll share some of those. So I think these are the questions that really need to be addressed, even by plenty of, let's say, anti-Zionist speakers who too often just try to answer the question on the threat of liberation in terms of simple racism or dehumanization. I think those are just too thin to say the West doesn't want it liberated because they're just racist. I think that's too thin, and it's not honest enough. There are incentives and mechanisms of empire at play, and any analysis which leaves them out is, I think, inadequate. I think what you'll see here, too, in the essay is that this is an exploration of the difference between liberal and left. So I'll be pointing that out as I go along here. I think it's super important, and I think more people are waking up to that crucial distinction. Okay, first, to be massively charitable as possible and to demonstrate that I'm not trying to be malicious here, I'm going to start by adopting their lens. It's a secular, liberal lens of moral, political, and historical analysis. And I want to show just how rational and reasonable and maybe holistic and attractive it appears. So this is really what it sounds like. We're engaged in a war of ideas, a clash of civilizations. There are different beliefs about reality, about the afterlife, about the purpose of life, all of that. And those beliefs cluster in tribes or nations or religions or families, maybe internet networks now, whatever it is. And these ideas, they live in people's heads, they inhabit them. And these beliefs govern their behavior. They shape how people think and therefore how they act in the world. And because different beliefs lead people to want and desire different things, people inevitably come into conflict. And when that happens, whether we're direct participants in the conflict or just observers, we feel like we have to analyze it, morally assess it, and try to figure out which beliefs are better or worse, which ones lead to good outcomes or bad outcomes. And now we can argue, of course, about which ones are good and which ones are bad, and whether it's maybe science that informs that, or religion, or something else entirely. But we still need to be able to morally assess these ideas. I mean, the conflict is there. And then ideally, once we make those determinations with some confidence, We want to build a world where the good ideas become more dominant, more popular, and the bad ideas either get transformed, extinguished, or maybe lose their appeal. And that worldview, of course, also sometimes leads to conflict, like I said, so maybe even violence or war. And when that happens, the best moral idea is to try to do violence as ethically as possible, with as little collateral damage as you can manage. Change people's minds if you can. Do that first, always. But if you can't, unfortunately, you might have to resort to a kind of emergency violence. And that violence should be targeted, surgical even, in a way that doesn't spill over and hurt anybody unnecessarily, if you can help it. And if that fails, you may have to be forced to take even more extreme measures of mass killing or surveillance or imprisonment or violent displacement. But we should always try conversation first and persuading people, because the battle of ideas waged with words is morally preferable to the battle of bombs and murder. That paragraph, of course, would cover something like the beeper attacks on Hezbollah, right? Which for someone of this mindset would be maybe impressively targeted, though they certainly did, even by this framework, result in some collateral damage, which is downright awful and regrettable. I actually just saw, I think it was Al Jazeera, just did a really interesting, maybe it wasn't them, I should link to it, really difficult piece where two young boys who were blinded by the beepers have become friends, and it's very difficult to watch. But, the Battle of Civilizations crowd, when they're brave enough, we'll call that a terribly unfortunate tragedy and ultimately place the blame on the people with the bad ideas that forced the hand of the operation, Hezbollah in that case. And the previous paragraph also covers even the forced starvation of Gaza to a degree, and even bombing cafes and snipering children or whatever they're doing there, again, because you can stretch the justification of collateral damage as far as you're psychologically able to stomach the horror show, as long as you maintain the sort of civilizational struggle underlying it, and just it's so dire that all of this is a kind of forced and regrettable, tragic thing. Okay, this all sounds pretty rational and reasonable and attractive in a way, right? It's clean. It sounds even compassionate and maybe non-racist or non-tribalist in some ways, because if you focus on this notion of ideas animating bodies, which are the real enemies, the ideas don't have skin color or identity. You could like good ideas or bad ideas in anybody. It's not the brown skin that you hate. It's not even the body at all. It's just the ideas bouncing around the brain underneath the skull. I mean, in a way, the person you are killing or forced to kill, in your view, is a form of collateral damage, even if it's just one person, of the idea that you really wish you could target if you were surgical enough that's in their brain, right? You get it. And this, by the way, this is the secular liberal lens of the world. That's their view. The religious conservative lens operates almost in the same way, but it will just categorize the clash of civilizations along different moral, philosophical grounding conversation lines, which point more towards divine command theory. And the secular conservative lens will make the same moves, but sort out the moral philosophy grounding problem, maybe through a kind of naturalistic Darwinian conversation. I think someone like Jordan Peterson is a kind of frustratingly, straddles both those conservative camps for people. Maybe someone like Douglas Murray or Niall Ferguson is in the latter one fully, the secular conservative one, or maybe the religious conservative one for Niall. Someone like Mike Huckabee certainly falls into that religious one. And of course, there's a bevy of people from Thomas Jefferson onward who fall into the secular liberal one. Okay, and now let's take this secular liberal lens and think of obvious conflicts now. Israel and Iran, Palestine, of course, Sudan, Ukraine, Venezuela, Myanmar, perhaps, or even just questions of underdevelopment in most of Africa or something. You can lay this lens over the world and try to analyze the situation using this lens of ideas, and it will always reveal or illuminate some ideas in the present moment that are in people's heads that have various goodness or badness with different degrees of adherence and commitment. And this battle of ideas lens becomes the lens which people morally assess just about all situations. And it's very powerfully attractive, this framework, and especially ascendant in the West, where science-minded secular liberals who, eschew religion and what they feel are unenlightened emotional attachments to God or blood or soil, etc. Okay, so I think there's some really big problems with this lens and with this worldview, even though it is attractive and adaptable for all those reasons I mentioned. And it sounds like it's striving to be very rational and reasonable and open to evidence, all of those lovely things. But I don't think people who cling to this worldview are as open to evidence and reason and honest analysis of human behavior as they like to profess. So the problems arise when this lens becomes the only lens through which one views the world. Because I'm not going to throw the lens away or say that it's worthless entirely, but it can't be the only one you use. So here's some of the problems that occur when that happens. So one of the major problems, of course, is that it makes people uninterested in history. This has been demonstrated by many popular thinkers, and some of whom are now just outwardly saying that they think history is not relevant. Specifically, I'm talking about the history here of maybe how certain ideas, even if you think that they're bad ideas, came to power in the first place. I mean, how did they become ascendant or entrenched or weaponized? How did they gain influence in certain groups or cultures? I think those are questions of history. For example, let's say you take a quick survey and sociological study of some area in a particular year in the past. You jump in a time machine and hop out with your notebook and you do your study. And maybe there was a bad idea floating around in a particular tribe or community, but it wasn't very attractive. It didn't hold much power. It was kind of marginal. Most people kind of laughed it off or made fun of it, the people who liked it. Perhaps the idea was even articulated in an ancient holy book or religious tenet or something. Okay, and then 20 or 50 years later, you revisit the same area, and then suddenly that same idea is suddenly in a position of power, and it's animating huge numbers of people who truly, genuinely believe in it. And they are telling you, loudly and plainly that they do. It's suddenly enforced, the idea, perhaps even over people who don't like it or hold the idea. Okay, interesting, right? I mean, you might be thinking of something like forced hair covering for women in certain countries when 75 years ago it was literally a marginal idea which was openly laughed at by those in power and the vast majority of the population. So I think understanding how the situation got from point A to point B, that process, it ought to be important, even within this war of ideas in the present kind of worldview. If you think that particular idea is a bad one, well, maybe understanding that historical process might help one figure out how to reduce the appeal or power of the bad idea now, in the present and the future, which is what we care about. If we can see the path that it took to rise and the conditions of that rising, maybe we can better understand how to respond to it and get it to set, as it were. And so in that regard, history should at least play an informative role, maybe to even help us figure out how to get out of certain situations. And if the idea is bolstered by, encouraged by, or even generated by an ancient religious text, for example, that's relevant information, certainly, but certainly the fact that the historical and political and cultural context is changing, but the religious text never is, ought to be a rather important piece of evidence to narrate and explain the ascendance of the bad idea, at least, into a position of power. Okay, but for the battle of ideas person, this historical analysis might not always matter that much, right? Because an idea can become so entrenched and inflamed and dangerously animated that knowing the history won't necessarily help you deal with the emergency at hand, especially when people are already maybe too far gone or too fired up. You still might have to use violence to deal with it, and history can't be changed anyway, right? I think you can probably already hear how dangerous this problem in the worldview is, that one can get perpetually stuck in dealing with an emergency and claiming a disinterest in history because, the house is on fire and we just need to put out the flames before figuring out how the fire started. You can see how easily hijacked and manipulated this mindset can be when the fire itself might be a very useful asset for certain political projects and incentives, but more on that later. because hinting at that in the analogy that the fire of bad ideas might be incentivized or be ignited or maybe be allowed to spread or whatever, that begins to shift our focus away from this lens of ideas. So let me save it. All right, so that's potentially one problem, that history tends to be ignored, downplayed, or even erased under the urgent demands of the present, when I really think it shouldn't be, especially as an obviously informative piece of data for how we might reduce the problem. Okay, another problem is the problem of power imbalances and who actually gets to play that kind of cynical game with the fire analogy I just described. I mean, if you enter the world at any point, which of course we all do the moment we're born, we're stepping into conflicts and systems and histories that are already underway. And you're stepping into a personal situation, even with its own kind of privileges and perils or problems or whatever. And the systems are never equal, and the world just doesn't work that way. And by power imbalances, I mean all kinds: physical power, the ability to kill, access to weaponry, technology, money, information, the power of the media. And if you're on the weaker side of those equations, if you're up against a force with actual metal shields and drones and air dominance and wealth, you might feel like the only option is either to submit to the oppression, or what you perceive as oppression, or of course to fight it. And if you are outgunned and out-teched, you'll end up using guerrilla tactics. And those tactics often carry a distinct kind of moral stain, which will always be open to framings of uncivilized and barbaric kind of methodology. They're messier, certainly less legal, more desperate. They can also be, as we've seen, effective to a degree. But they're completely vulnerable to charges of barbarism and terrorism, which, again, they might be. I'm not dismissing nefarious intentions here that are really believed, but I have much more on that in my Do You Condemn Hamas essay, if you're interested. But meanwhile, the entity in power, because they have the resources and control, can afford to engage in the conflict a little bit more by the book. They can act more disciplined, more measured, more legitimate in how they maintain the status quo and comply with the norms of the time. They can engage in self-critique or investigation, even have elections as sort of proof of their humility. And when it comes to actual violence, they can at least attempt to be targeted or provide warnings or whatever. And of course, Israel's conduct has alarmed some of the liberal onlookers who think, they may be getting sloppy here or letting the anger get the best of them or something. If there is any critique coming from the liberals, it's basically in that form, that Israel's in danger of becoming what they hate. And if they aren't careful, they'll lose this moral high ground. It's a really ugly kind of analysis in which you can perpetually blame your own brutalism on the inherent brutality of the neighborhood that you're in. Again, that position would be greatly challenged by history, which is a reason you will not be so eager to look there, lest you be confronted with responsibility of your own brutality. But anyway, if you're on the other side with little or no power, you're probably not having many of these conversations or concerns on targeting or warning populations. It's not even an option. You're not going to be so targeted. Sometimes you don't even know who or what exactly to target, so you target everyone and everything. And I'm certainly not justifying this. Again, more on that essay on Do You Condemn Hamas? And this activity and violence from the lens of the battle of ideas will be interpreted as revealing what your true intentions really are. And thus, then, is the barometer of why the world should do all it can to ensure that you never get any power. And this, of course, is what separates you morally from your enemy. You could picture like a simple fight. Like you're in a fight and you have a gun and maybe a really nice house. And you have this gun for self-defense, I suppose, a nice one. And there's this other guy who's really mad at you. And he's in this other place that's kind of crappier. And he's trying to find a gun. And he's saying, if I get a gun, I'm going to kill you. And then I'm going to take over the whole neighborhood and enslave everyone. And you're like, oh no, I better shoot him. And maybe you try to reason with him. But if it fails, you wait until the moment where he reaches for it. And then you pull the trigger and kill him and say, it was in self-defense. And you warned him. And this cycle just repeats and scales up. But of course, I started this situation with a massive power imbalance of who had the gun and the nice house in the first place, and who had the luxury of maybe sounding, like they were operating out of self-defense and being the civilized person. And I left history, of course, out of that hypothetical. And then the third problem is the one that really counts and interplays with those first two. So the most important problem with the battle of ideas lens is its assumption of intentions and its massive over-reliance on stated intentions. This is where, for a person of this kind of battle of ideas thinking, moral clarity is really cashed out. Intentions. What do people intend to do? What are their ends? Regardless of whether we think the means of achieving it are wise or smart or corrupt or whatever, it's the ends, the goals that really matter. What kind of world would you generate if you had the ultimate power to do so? What kind of God would you be? That's the ultimate test for the battle of ideas crowd. It's moral consequentialism at its core, and the intentions of what consequences one is aiming for, that's what everything hinges on. And I don't necessarily disagree with the concern with intentions, obviously. I think intentions should be taken incredibly seriously. But deciphering intentions is not as easy as some make it out to be. And I know my critics right now are thinking about maybe the intentions of an Islamist regime or certain violent groups or whatever of all kinds, which they are sure are on some kind of obvious divide of the clash of civilizations because they're announcing their intentions. And yes, I'm interested in deciphering intentions there, or of course taking them seriously, but I'm really interested in what is being taken for granted about the intentions on the other side of the divide that people are so sure is clear, of the intentions of the clash of civilizations of the civilized, in quotes. So in the previous scenario, the one guy who starts with the gun and says to the other angry dude, hey, just chill, man. I just want to live in peace. Just stop freaking out about everything over there. Let's just be buddies. And the other guy says, screw that. I don't trust you. I want to get a gun and shoot you. You're a jerk. You can just get a picture of being like, well, if you're observing this, well, those intentions are pretty clear, I guess, right? This one guy says, I want to live in peace and chill. And the other guy says, I want to kill this guy and enslave the whole neighborhood. So I guess the dude with the gun at the beginning just kind of had to shoot him when the guy started reaching for his gun. It was out of self-defense or in defense of the chill civilizational vision he had or whatever. It's simple, right? But of course, we have to be a little more intelligent and skeptical of that whole thing. I mean, I think these are actually exciting and interesting questions to tackle just on a human level. So I wish more people would take an active interest in them, not just in evaluating which intentions are good or bad in some kind of abstract moral laboratory of, utilitarianism, but actually in contending with the difficult work of understanding the authenticity of our own intentions and the integrity of them and the interplay with them with power and culture and resentment or psychological crippling, all that stuff. It really must be folded into the process of deciphering and contending with intentions, ours and theirs, everyone's. And this whole thing of the asymmetry of intentions and propaganda just can't be ignored or dismissed. People like me who contend not that the lens of the battle of ideas is wrong exactly, but it's inadequate on its own, we can't be dismissed as merely being confused or not understanding the mind of a jihadist or something like that. And we can't just be scoffed at as just being confused or deluded or, just apologists for people who would kill me if given the chance to actually reach for the gun. I want to deflect that up front here, because no, I understand that we ought to take beliefs seriously, and I'm not a suicidal pacifist or anything. In fact, I'm contending that I'm doing exactly that, taking beliefs and intentions very seriously. And people who stop with just the battle of ideas, if you stop right here with this lens, are not taking ideas and beliefs as seriously as they should. I mean, if that is your lens, that you like and you've been using and you think it's robust, that these people are just announcing their intentions right here in the present, and these people are announcing theirs, and now we just have to kind of sort it out as ethically as we can. If that's your lens for understanding and assessing your world, well, fine. But if you're dissatisfied with it, and I think you will be constantly, not just because of the moral nightmares that you'll have to swallow when you're dealing with it, but because you really will be unable to look very closely at history, which will deliver a massive cracking, blow to your lens. And it doesn't have to be the history of Palestine exactly. I really think you can pick just about any nation which was engaged in a kind of liberation and independence or freedom movement, maybe from World War I onward, and track it carefully through the next 100 years or so. And you're going to come out of it feeling like your battle of ideas lens just got a whole lot blurrier. I mean, I need to research this one a little more myself, but just to scratch the surface on something like the Dhofar Liberation Front, which was a Marxist liberation movement in Oman after World War II, which was organized all around feminist ideals. Women rejecting veiling, fighting for the right to divorce oppressive and abusive husbands, forming female militias. I mean, good ideas, right? Fighting directly bad ideas. Well, they were crushed. By who? By the Shah in Iran, who was working with the West, a coup engineered by the UK, Pakistani and Jordanian forces who were also Western aligned. All of this in service of installing a sultan who was loyal to the West and its economic interest there, which is access to the Gulf. And the propaganda urged on by the West, collaborating with religious authorities, particularly in the mosques, to frame these rebels as godless atheists, enemies of Islam, and a threat to family and tribal morality. This was a core part of the counterinsurgency strategy. It was planned and implemented, telling people that following the rebels will lead to hell, literally. From the sermons directly in the mosques on Fridays, preaching that the rebels are attacking Islamic modesty, disrupting male guardianship, and attempting to abolish hijab and prayer. By the way, the Dhofar liberation was not atheistic or godless or whatever. It was not some godless assault on Islam. In fact, many fighters were religious Muslims who say the Sultan's rule was un-Islamic and unjust. One rebel reportedly said, "We fight not against Islam, but against those who betray it." I found that in some of their literature, and there was plenty of fighters who prayed, kind of even before they shifted more towards a Marxist attitude. Anyway, of course, all of this gets cashed out and swallowed up by some Cold War logic of a clash of civilizations. Those who still reach for this clash of civilizations framework will point to the Cold War logic as somehow making this some sort of collateral damage. But I think it's easy to see that if you're just concerned about intentions and motivations and ideas here, you're going to maybe start to look a little closer and with a little more skepticism at the West's intentions with all of their rhetoric about freedom and democracy and even feminism or personal freedom, right? Okay, so what did we end up getting in Oman? Well, a monarchy rule and Western access to the Gulf, where he was never allowed to practice any political opposition. Oman is an absolute monarchy with no free press, no real political parties, heavy surveillance, and where many Omanis remember the Dhofar revolution only vaguely. It's not taught in schools, of course, and it's basically been erased from their public memory. So, were the ideas of feminism and anti-authoritarian democratic efforts really all that bad? Is the clash of civilizations with clear good guys and bad guys with that lens, is that helping you out with that picture? Does hearing that story at all color or change or at least spark curiosity to look at its next door neighbor, Yemen, and what's emerged there some 50 years later? Does it cast any kind of complexity over the moral and political analysis of something like feminism and the efforts in Iran now, which, of course, I completely support and understand, but I hope they read their history and pay close attention to something like what happened in Oman. And again, I think this is scary for a lot of people. They don't want to look. They don't want to know. Perhaps they fear slipping into a kind of apologetics for violence and potentially awful, dangerous ideas. And I do get that. Again, this is going to be an incredibly difficult time for people. But I'll remind you one of my favorite quotes. He probably didn't say it since he gets accredited with everything, but I think it was Einstein. He said, "The mark of an intelligent mind is one that is able to entertain an idea without accepting it." It's easier said than done, by the way. But anyway, back to the lenses. So we need to consider how belief operates in a human, with all of our hang-ups and biases and historical trappings and existential fears of freedom and denials of death and all of our, positions of power and all that stuff, all that needs to be considered rather than maybe wondering how a belief operates in a kind of, and animates maybe a kind of disembodied determinist physics machine, which seems to be kind of the favored way of many of these battle of ideas people in the science-loving atheistic camp. But okay, let's take one of these questions of belief and intentions and ideas and challenge it a bit. So let's say you've got culture A with its own ideas and beliefs located over here in territory A, and then there's culture B with its own ideas and beliefs over here in territory B. Now let's say their beliefs are different, and that's fine up to a point, but suppose the people in territory A want or need something that exists over there in territory B. Maybe it's land, maybe it's resources, maybe it's just energy, raw material, greed for the sake of it, human labor, whatever. Maybe that need comes from a kind of currency system which is reliant on the engine of debt and the ability to export the pressures of inflation. I'm hinting there, of course, at future episodes and essays on the economics of debt and the empire that we're running. But anyway, it doesn't matter. Let's just say A wants something over there in B. And in that case, it becomes pretty easy to see how culture A would benefit from viewing culture B as irrational or uncivilized or savage or inhumane, barbaric, bandits, marauders, pirates, banditos, red-faced tigers. By the way, those are all real words which have been very popular from time to time in the process of dehumanization in different eras. The red-faced tigers one was used by a newspaper that I found about Native Americans engaged in violence against American settlements in the 1700s. It sounds kind of cool and fierce now, red-faced tigers. And the marauders one was really commonly used by Zionist paramilitary gangs and groups like the Irgun and the Haganah. It was popular in their radio broadcasts in the mid to late 40s when referencing the Palestinians, who they of course called the Arabs. They used marauders and murderers quite often. But anyway, I'm quite sure the popular catch-all word from our time of terrorists, of course, will one day add its name to this list and be discussed in curious ways by future historians and commentators. But in any case, culture A will paint culture B as a kind of lesser than people. And it would also benefit culture A if the culture B, if the people in culture B were inflamed and angry to a point of expressing violent thoughts or even saying they want to kill culture A, because you want something in territory B. If you want that, it's in your interest to demonize culture B, of course, but it's definitely in your interest if culture B participates in that demonization. If they lash out, if they demonize you back, if they demean themselves publicly or reveal themselves to be inhumane, if they echo your pronouncements of them, it kind of reinforces your mental position and serves as a moral shielding to any onlookers. I think even in interpersonal fighting relationships, we can recognize this almost desire for the other side to declare how their inhumanities, so then you can do what you need to do. So if you want something in the other guy's house, for example, and he starts yelling about how much he hates you and how he's going to find a gun and kill you, and he calls you inhumane names or whatever, well then, I guess you have to pull the trigger and eliminate him because he's just so unreasonably barbaric and murderous, and he was coming after you after all. One can't really blame you for doing that. The whole thing is just a regrettable tragedy. And then you get to go ahead and take whatever it was you wanted in the first place, just as a bonus. Let me really stress this point, because killing out of self-defense is really the thing that matters here. That's what you're really aiming for if you're trying to game the system of the moral conversation. And just about every moral culture or religious notion, except for maybe the most extreme forms of pacifism, everyone really kind of understands that killing is bad, but killing out of genuine self-defense is basically morally permissible. It's regrettable, sure, you wish you could have worked it out in conversation, but they were reaching for a gun and had every intention to kill me, so I used deadly force. Maybe even after trying non-lethal force first, right? Self-defense is literally the get-out-of-jail-free card. So being able to claim it, and even better, to have it be really true, is incredibly powerful. And really the only thing you need to maintain on your side of the argument. If there are other motives at play, you just need that one. I mean, the UK or the West generally, in that story about crushing the feminist uprising in Oman, could be morally defended, I guess, as self-defense against the Soviet menace, which threatened to kill and suppress everyone in the world, right? You always have to drive the killing to rational and noble self-defense or civilizational defense of which you are devoting or equating yourself to in the self-defense. You could take the obvious example here, I'm sure you're thinking of Israel funding Hamas and publicly calling them an asset, because the more visible, aggressive, extreme, and irrational and dangerous the Hamas rhetoric and activity becomes, the more it provides moral cover for Israel, in this example, to advance whatever desires and motivations they have. So yes, it's in your benefit, it's in your interest, if you want something in Territory B, for the more extreme elements of Culture B to rise and be visible, so you can wield the moral shield of self-defense and be acquitted by the moral jury in all of the minds of the secular liberal world. I mean, I think this is a really wildly underreported moment from the past 2 years when Hamas, I think it was Jeremy Scahill who reported this, but reported that in negotiations with Israel, Hamas presented as a negotiating point actually stepping down and not being the governing body of Gaza any longer. They proposed to have Palestinian technocrats step in and take over that function. And Israel was the one who crossed that out in their counter-proposal to Hamas. I mean, it was just kind of an eye-popping, obvious moment against the stated goals or war aims or whatever they were saying of eliminating Hamas. And of course, there was also that moment when one of Trump's negotiators dared to mention that Hamas didn't have horns or whatever, they would wear suits or were sort of reasonable people. He was yanked from the television circuit rather quickly. Anyway, this dynamic I'm talking about is not just Israel and Palestine, so I'll try to keep going back to that abstract example. So let's go back to the original intentions. What might they be? If Culture A just wants the land, just wants it for power or greed or resources or expansion or even a divine claim, those aren't really honorable motives for the secular, liberal-minded lens that I'm trying to investigate and really steelman here. That's not really what they, will fly for them. So it's not even what they really believe about their own intentions, usually. If it's just theft, even divine theft to a degree, that project probably won't get off the ground very much in people's minds or garner the support of the liberal world, of course. So instead, you'll hear other beliefs and stated intentions. Of course, you'll hear self-defense or even preemptive protective measures that you're taking. They want the land as a buffer zone. That could work, right? I've heard this before, even by liberals, as an explanation for West Bank settlement expansion. It's kind of comical. I don't know. They've never really explained it, but I've heard it. Maybe you'll hear that the intention is to liberate the other people, liberate them from Hamas or something. Maybe it's to help the land flourish and grow and be used in a more moral and productive way. And of course, for the conservative mind, you might hear religious intentions of reclaiming the land or returning in a kind of divine miracle. Those tend to not fly as well for the secular liberal. Clearly, the West Bank settlements are quite the stretch for the secular liberal intentions of basic self-defense or deterrence. That's why you'll likely hear some critique of those particular settlements from secular liberals, like I did growing up. Though, like I said before, I've heard people even try to stretch some self-defense towards those, which, is ludicrous amount of mental gymnastics, but whatever. The point is, you almost never hear the, we just want it because we want it. You hear self-defense and peacekeeping, noble and moral and permissible intentions, with, of course, the occasional divine land rights mixed in for good measure. I think this is how a lot of secular liberal people who haven't paid much attention to this whole thing kind of think like. They feel like they came across two kids involved in some vicious fight. One is a rich kid claiming that they just, wanted to be left alone and in peace and relax. But the other kid just wouldn't let him and just kept threatening him. And then he did a bunch of really bad stuff. And so, so he got really fed up and he punched him really hard just to get him to stop. I mean, it was out of self-defense, obviously, and he would totally stop hitting him if the other kid just agreed to either move away or just chill out and promise not to do any of that stuff anymore. And the poor kid who's getting punched is saying, you can't believe him. He's lying to you. He wasn't leaving me alone. He was totally picking on me and treating me like crap. He actually started it. And you, as, the teacher coming across this fight or whatever, are just like, I don't care who started it. You could read that, of course, as I don't think history is relevant. Can't you just both chill out and apologize to each other and just share and be reasonable? And the one kid, maybe the rich kid, says, sure, that's what I wanted to do. If he would just leave me alone, I'll just wait for him over here. And the other kid is like, well, he's lying. Look, he's still picking on me every time you turn your back, and he totally owes me for what he did to me already. He stole a bunch of stuff, and he never paid me back or anything. And then that poor kid might throw a punch or say a bunch of really mean things and threatening things again, and then the kid crushes him and punches him even harder and, shrugs and claims self-defense, and this cycle just continues. Okay, that's obviously a really simple view of the morality at play here, but I think it's pretty familiar. And so here's where I finally want, and I think inadequate, as you can see, so I finally want to bring in another lens of analysis, because I keep saying this battle of ideas lens with this emphasis on stated intentions is inadequate on its own, and I feel like I've pushed it just about as far as it can go, and I don't want to throw it away. Ideas are powerful on their own, and the beliefs we have to form or, in our heads to rationalize or justify our behavior or our attitudes are massively important. So I don't want to get rid of it. I just want to add to it. We simply need to be able to consider the possibilities that there are other intentions at play beyond the stated ones that are operational here. And this is true for both the powerful entity and the weaker one, of course. And so now I'm going to talk about other lenses beyond the simple battle of ideas in the present. These are battle for resources, wealth, control, power, economic growth, maybe economic systems that have gotten out of control, whatever. These lenses, by the way, are not mutually exclusive. And in fact, they work in tandem. I think some people make the mistake when analyzing the world of choosing one and completely discounting the other. Doing that is just going to leave everybody very confused and everybody fighting with each other, and at least one of those aspects completely open to manipulation and the possibility of becoming a useful idiot for the other one. Because there's people who might say, well, it's only a battle of ideas, and all this stuff about resources and control or currency dominance or whatever, it's all just kind of a sideshow full of conspiracy theorists, of course, who are just uncomfortable accepting the obvious stated intentions. They just want to look for something deeper because they just can't imagine that someone would be so driven by a purely hateful kind of idea. The world is just about clashing visions of what happiness and flourishing means, and the fight for resources is just a function of how important it is that we keep the material and the power in the sphere of those who have the good ideas. That's really the whole picture. That's, again, the secular liberal lens. But then on the other side, there's people who say, well, it's all about resources and control and maintaining power dynamics. And the stuff about beliefs and ideas in the afterlife or whatever it is kind of just window dressing that we do as humans that no one really believes anyway. So we could just kind of ignore all that stuff as just this sideshow and quirk of human myth-making. I think the exclusive language of either camp really leads us nowhere, or to insanity, which many of us must be feeling at this point. And that language of either exclusive camp will only benefit those in power and the status quo, and nothing really changes. By only choosing one framework, you're just going to be exploited by the other one. But there is an unfair asymmetry in the playing field there that I think a lot of people are unknowingly participating in. So take Iran, for example, and its clash with Israel, and these recent bombing campaigns that Europe largely cheered on. You might say, with this lens of battle of ideas, well, the Islamic Republic of Iran holds a lot of really bad ideas in terms of, some kind of universal human rights and individual freedoms. And so you're assessing it through that lens, and yeah, I agree. And sure, that bombing mission killed people. They bombed entire blocks, and it's tragic, but people might say it was relatively low collateral damage, a phrase, of course, I find really dangerous. And then from there, they might say, well, ideally, the Islamic Republic would just disappear, either by collapse or by people changing their minds or the ideology being sidelined over time. That's the kind of assessment people make when they buy into this battle of ideas framework. And I'm no fan of the Islamic Republic, but if we're going to tell that story, framing it purely as a clash of beliefs and ideas in the world, we're going to discount history again. Because that regime wasn't always ascendant, and those ideas weren't always dominant in that region or that culture. Sure, maybe the seeds were there, maybe in the religious texts, in the background, waiting to be ignited given the right world events, but they weren't always inflamed. So look back at the 1953 coup against Mossadegh. If we skip over that part, we're going to end up seriously confused about the intentions at play in these conflicts. Because in this case, the West, meaning the US, Israel, Europe, etc., can frame the whole thing as, we're just trying to liberate the people of Iran from a terrible regime. Or maybe it's about our safety, or a combination of both. They'll say, what we want for the wonderful people of Iran is freedom, liberation from their brutal regime, a better life, freedom for women maybe, while securing safety for ourselves and mutual prosperity. If Bibi says things just like that, right? And sure, they can all say that. And a battle of ideas analysis will surely say, well, those are good ideas, which should somehow win out. But how then does one explain who installed the Shah and overthrew Mossadegh? Does that history count as any kind of evidence against the stated intentions of liberation for the people of Iran by the freedom-loving West? Does it add to the story of distrust or hatred of the West and its allies in that part of the world? Does that history throw a wrench into the logic of stated intentions and ideas in the present? I think it obviously does, and thus it's usually downplayed or ignored completely by these kinds of people, the liberal battle of ideas people. By the way, Coup 53 is an excellent movie if you want to learn about the Mossadegh coup. Because the West's stated intention, their belief, which I do think many of them sincerely hold, that they want freedom and liberation for the Iranian people, is completely betrayed by their actions. And I don't see how you square that, without either ignoring or downplaying history entirely. I think it becomes very convenient for enlightened philosophers and political analysts in the West to say that we shouldn't put too much weight on history or look at it too closely, while those in places like Iran might have a longer memory and be pretty interested in reminding the West of why they're so darn distrustful, right? So, the very quick review, Mossadegh was a democratically elected and wildly popular leader, especially with the lower wealth population. He wasn't a communist, he hated communists, and he rose to power after generations, even centuries, of brutal, exploitative imperialism from Britain and Russia. British imperialism in particular had been overtly racist and pretty unfair. So when colonialism formally ends, in quotes, there he is, Mossadegh, elected by the people, immensely popular, secular, Western educated in Switzerland. He didn't advocate for forced hijab wearing or anything like that. He was pretty distrustful of the political aspirations of the Islamic clergy. And he looks around and says, wait a second, we've got all this oil and this British company is sitting on it under a contract that's so one-sided it's almost comical, that they signed with a now defunct regime which was completely corrupt and undemocratic and didn't represent the people at all. And almost all of the wealth from it is flowing straight out of Iran. And Mossadegh's thinking is pretty understandable, right? These contracts were signed with illegitimate, imperialist, racist empires. They weren't democratic agreements. And the poor people in Persia who've waited long enough have chosen me to make their lives better. So what does he do? Well, he basically tears up the contract after negotiations, kicks out the British, or most of them, and decides to, in quotes, nationalize the oil, which is just to basically sell it on the global market and use the wealth from the sales, because everyone wanted it, of course, to build hospitals and schools and infrastructure, to actually invest in the well-being of the people who've been ignored for so long in his own country. Sounds a little bit like Iran first, right? Or maybe just Iran finally, or Iran too. We don't need to be first, but just get a fair shake of the wealth under our own feet, right? I mean, he barely talked about Israel, by the way. It was 1951, and his focus was on trying to bring wealth to this, new Iran and build up the nation. Iran even recognized Israel in 1950. Basically, Mossadegh was taking a pretty direct, non-aligned and imperialist, anti-imperialist stance. He wasn't anti-Semitic. Iran's Jewish population, which was substantial at the time, plenty of them supported him. Iran actually took in like 116,000 Jewish refugees during World War II, most from Poland who had fled to the USSR between 42 and 44. Isfahan became known as the city of Polish children for housing so many orphaned Jewish kids. And by all accounts, they were treated very well and didn't suffer any kind of official discrimination. In 2004, even Yad Vashem in Jerusalem acknowledged Iran's role in saving Jewish lives during World War II. So anyway, Mossadegh wasn't perfect, of course, but that overall vision, it sounds a lot like the very same kind of liberation and freedom that the West claims that it wants for Iran. And frankly, I think people like Tucker Carlson or Candace Owens or Dave Smith or probably a ton of Trump voters think really shouldn't be a problem at all, right? Let them do what they want over there. As long as they're just leaving us alone, they want to engage in the free market and sell their stuff and profit off of it and use those profits to help their own people in a way that their people decide is cool. Sure, we love free markets, right? We love free trade. Let's just worry about America already, right? I think that is kind of the naive vision of things that needs to be challenged by this deeper insight of empire. Because why was it then that the UK and the US helped orchestrate his removal in a violent coup? Why were we so eager to get rid of him and slander him with a massive amount of manipulation and infiltration into their media? They called him a communist, even though, of course, he hated the communists. They mobilized elites against him and the military. And why? Was that to liberate the people of Iran? So he gets booted, and the West installs the Shah, who's a brutal and secular ruler, who just so happens to basically reinstate all those old contracts, basically handing control of Iran's oil reserves back over to the West. Perhaps, of course, with a touch more wealth that was flowing to the people of Iran compared to maybe its imperial days, which creates a crazy amount of wealth of the elite class, which of course then will brew even more resentment and internal hatred and rivalries. And predictably, I think almost inevitably, a reactionary movement emerges. The Shah was hostile to religion, and the regime was closely aligned with Western powers and installed by him. So of course the opposition saw itself as anti-Western, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial, which of course came to easily view the project of Israel as an outpost of those things. And that reactionary movement cloaked itself, like many do, in religious language. So the movement became ascendant, and eventually it took power as the Islamic Revolution, and it redirected Iran's oil away from the Western pipeline. And for that, of course, it was hit with intense sanctions, which continue to this day. And, it's sold and promoted in the West as being due to their anti-human rights policies or something, rather than any kind of resource trading business. They've, of course, tried to find other trade partners like China, but they're still suffering for all of this. And the regime that was born out of an anti-Western, anti-imperialist energy and speaks in a very prideful Islamic language certainly has become deeply repressive. And again, I'm no fan of what they do. But how are we supposed to assess the West's stated intentions, this idea of liberation and freedom, without including that history in an obvious case of unplugging a nascent popular movement of sovereignty and freedom, which was birthed in 1951 and then squashed by the West in 1953? How would this ever be discovered or included in, let's say, intention-based moral analysis by only applying the lens of the battle of ideas in the present, that people are professing? And how convenient for the systems which might benefit from those resource flows and exploitative contracts for it not to be discussed or considered. This is why so many people are just so interested in not wanting to talk about or bring up history, especially when it comes to conversations about Israel and motivations and intentions. I mean, to be honest with yourself, how many of us knew much about Mossadegh, those of us in the West, if anything at all, maybe just 2 years ago? Let's all just be honest. I mean, I barely knew anything. I may have been able to place his name, but I didn't really know that story. And I'm a little pissed about that. It seems like it's kind of by design, right? Because that information could be a little dangerous and pull the rug out of this secular liberal manifesto that we've grown up with. I think we all have a chance now to be a bit skeptical about stated intentions in the present, and we have to upgrade our knowledge and thinking to at least a little bit understand our levels of distrust there and here, right? And I want to try another quick thing about the variable of Islam here. Because with this picture I'm painting, because I've now said Oman and Iran, because like I said, you can basically pick like 70 different countries to look at that have similar trajectories and analogies to the Iran or Oman stories that I've shared. And so many of them should serve, I think, as a real cure for anyone who's just a bit too attached to the liberal battle of ideas mindset. It should at least cure them of some of the naive faith that something like America or Israel or whatever is really interested in, waving a magic wand and turning the world into a liberated, free market, peaceful playground if they had such a magic wand, no matter what they think someone like the Ayatollah would do with such a wand. But it does bring up this interesting question about what liberation is or what it really means. Because I've spoken a bit before about my experiences in a place like Ghana. And Ghana is definitely one of the countries we can look at. And we can do so almost a side-by-side comparison of a sort of historical trajectory with Iran that's kind of interesting. So again, I'm not meaning to completely gloss over the differences or squash the important different dynamics there, but basically consider Ghana and Iran and fly into the year 1950. Both territories are locked into a kind of overt exploitative relationship with foreign powers, both Britain, coincidentally, at the time. Ghana, still a formal colony with stirring movements to gain independence, and Iran locked in those exploitative oil deals for one thing. And then both have movements to try to break these relationships. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah becomes the leader of the liberation movement and gets formal recognition as the founding of the state, the first independent state, in 1957. And Mossadegh, like we said, rises in a popular movement to power. Both are interested in looking around at their resources and figuring out a way to monetize it, sell it to the world, and have the profits go to their people, finally. In Ghana, it was a lot about cocoa and electricity from a big dam project in the east. And in Iran, it was oil and the shipping lanes, of course, that are massively important there. And then both get accused of being communists or socialists for wanting to nationalize or take back control of their resources from the foreign companies or governments who were exploiting them. Both get courted by Cold War dynamics of, looking for assistance from the West or the Soviets. Both are more interested in just kind of helping their own people, kind of non-aligned. Both get couped by Western-backed coups. In Iran, the Shah is installed, and in Ghana, a series of kind of Western-friendly leaders takes power. In both cases, the foreign investment, they always call it that, although most of the profits just flow outward again, returns, so the foreign companies return, and then, okay, look now, in Iran, you get this anti-Western sentiment, and it grows, and the anger brews, and eventually you get the Islamic Revolution and a kind of leadership and the problem that we have now. And in Ghana, well, there is resentment growing. The prosperity, I think, is stalling for sure. They took out huge IMF loans, which they weren't able to pay back. They were eventually forgiven, but with only huge austerity measures about hollowing out public works that they were engaged in and returning certain things back to the international private sector. And I don't know, Ghana is where a developing nation might be. Maybe their patience with the entire project is running out and running a little thin at this point. The question is, maybe they're thinking or wondering if this is really going to deliver them the freedom and sovereignty and prosperity that they were promised. I'm not sure. Is it liberation? Is Ghana free? Is it liberated? Is this what Kwame Nkrumah himself feared would happen when he wrote the book Neo-Colonialism in 1965? But, okay, is Ghana militarizing itself and producing what the West calls, terrorism on a wide scale? No, not really, right? So in that story, if I'm being a bit unfair, was the variable of Islam in this comparison versus, let's say, the predominance of Christianity in Ghana, was that an operational variable in producing the kind of Iran we see today versus the kind of Ghana we see today? Obviously, there's a lot of other variables there. I don't really know, but I think this is the kind of analysis, and now this is really a leftist analysis, that really scares some people. Again, because they fear they'll end up apologizing for or even promoting bad ideas or violence or whatever. And honestly, it shouldn't be that scary. Of course, there is a way to gesture towards Ghana as maybe being too passive in its post-World War II life versus Iran being way too aggressive. And you could point to religious organization and teaching there if you want. But the point is the liberation question remains for both of them. And Ghana, I think one would be hard-pressed to say, is any closer to achieving the kind of liberation that someone like Kwame Nkrumah or Mossadegh really was envisioning. Ironically, Islam, the word means submission, may make people less submissive to this particular historical force of imperialism or colonialization or whatever we call it from the outside than something maybe like a Christian nation in Ghana, which has been, I love the country. It strikes me as a bit more submissive and cooperative with the same West, which denied it the trajectory of striving for independence and liberation. And then what are we left with, I think, is the deeper question, a really, really good one, of what does liberation actually mean? What does freedom actually mean? Is it possible that the West genuinely believes that liberation is the form of dollar-dominated capitalism that they push and insist upon much of the world? That freedom and liberation means being forced to participate in an exploitative market? Have they convinced themselves that reinstalling the monarchy, something Israel has explicitly threatened to do on Twitter, posts in Iran and all that this is somehow good for the people of Iran, or whoever's on the receiving end of that? That in the long run, this kind of opening up their resources to internationally owned private firms will raise all boats in some kind of global trickle-down equation? That, you Iranians or Ghanaians or whatever, you can't be trusted with your own resources, that you must allow companies from France or Texas or wherever to do the work, and that we'll kick back a bit of the profits as a favor, and that's, the best that you can hope for. That this is liberation. Is that what's going on here? Well, the moment you start talking like that, you start sounding exactly like the colonizers and imperialists of the previous century who were all claiming they were on civilizing missions, that they were educating the people, that they had just found savages in India or Africa or wherever, and they were lifting them up, bringing them Christianity and commerce or whatever. That story is very convenient, but it just isn't true. And the Global South remembers it. And so, I mentioned this idea of exploitative capitalism a lot, and I don't want to be flippant about it. I'm not making some blanket anti-capitalist argument here. Like I stressed in my introduction, I want us all to really try to understand the specific mechanisms of this thing. I'm talking like specifically the petrodollar system and the global reserve currency being the US dollar and the extraordinary privilege of that system in America, how debt economies and interest ensures a treadmill of inflation which America tries to push to these places I've mentioned. When I say that culture A might need something in territory B, I'm using need there in a way, that's like if they don't secure the oil or the minerals or the shipping lanes or whatever, or keep those things in the hands of leaders who offer them massive discounts rather than try to nationalize them or, God forbid, use them for their own people, then America has to suffer or will suffer the kind of inflation or hyperinflation that any nation running that kind of debt would experience if it didn't have the kind of system that it has with the global reserve currency and everything else. So when I say it needs it, that's what I'm saying, that it needs maybe a kind of insatiable exploitation. And again, that's not some kind of blanket anti-market or anti-capitalist rant. It's a very specific form and mechanism of control, which is really important to know if you're going to try to answer my initial question of how something like a liberated Iran, or let's say Saudi Arabia, is a threat to the West. And to answer that question, would be exactly the same no matter what religion or ideas were in the heads of the people there. It's possible that these economic systems and other systems do get out of control, kind of like a snowball running downhill, that a system like this just keeps getting passed from one leader to the next, kind of like a monster that no one really knows how to stop at this point without collapsing the entire economy. Although it all starts to feel and sound a lot like a ticking time bomb, which obviously many of us are feeling the world feels a bit like these days. So that's really where my head is at these days, and where I'd love to meet as many of you as I can. I think it's a scary time, but a really exciting time. There are a lot of on-ramps to this conversation, from the moral nightmare that I mentioned of Gaza, or to the Epstein cover-up, to simply cracking open any of the histories and many more that I mentioned, or than I mentioned. And it should all serve to help, I hope, advance a better conversation. But for the liberal secular lens, the really stubborn and attractive one I've tried to tackle here, I think there is one more thing to mention in Fear, because if they're horrified at all by the moral costs of what they call collateral damage, or even if they think certain countries have gone too far, that problem can be mitigated for them, the moral problem of going too far to a certain degree. For example, if they think bombing children who are next to a target of a guy with a really bad idea or something that they just need to get rid of is just too ugly, the dead children after, that they just can't harm those kids anymore. Well, great, okay. And to be fair, I think there are some liberals who, are really sad about this, right? They call it a tragedy, and they if they even look, if they can't look. Well, I think governments are becoming sensitive to this kind of backlash too. I think it was Smotrich who said a while ago that it might be moral to let 2 million Palestinians starve to death, but the world won't let us do it. Though they're certainly trying. If this becomes too much of a kind of PR problem for them, they can always develop a more targeted approach. So let's give them the benefit of the doubt that they certainly haven't earned, but let's just say the West is acting rationally and they believe their vision of freedom, this neoliberal exploitative vision, is actually, peaceful, or let's say as peaceful as one can hope for, given the alternatives in a kind of Hobbesian adoption of human nature as inherently violent or something. And that this system will raise all boats eventually. Maybe they even reference the work of Steven Pinker. Okay, well then what? They tell themselves, we're not monsters. Let's just do this better. We'll just zap the dissidents, especially the really dangerous ones, the genocidal, those religiously genocidal ones. But we'll be precise. We'll be careful. We won't create more of them, even though history shows the opposite always happens. But let's assume the best intentions. Let's say someone is in charge and is genuinely trying to be targeted to avoid unnecessary suffering. I think the tools for that kind of targeting will only get stronger. If you look at the Beeper Hezbollah attack, there was some collateral damage, dismemberment, blindness, etc., but it was more targeted. But now imagine a future where they can just zap you in your chair from a distance and just, neutralize you. Or worse, zap you in your chair and change your mind, re-educate you, put you in a prison of one and program you in a more peaceful worldview. Remove those dangerous ideas from your head entirely. That world, I think, might be tremendously peaceful on the surface. And I think the one, the peaceful secular liberal would want, and the method they would prefer rather than all of this sloppy bombing and starvation. But would that be a free and liberated world? If your vision of the world is one where we move away from these high collateral damage strategies that are becoming more common in places like Israel or the US, and instead shift towards neutralizing threats quickly and cleanly, well, that might reduce bloodshed and soothe the moral discomfort and tragedy some people might be struggling with, even in this this liberal lens. But it's still not a free world. And I think it's an unjust world, even if it has less explosions and bloodshed. As a terrible example, to just draw out my point, basically if every post-colonial country trajectory had been a little bit more like Ghana rather than Iran, would we call that a liberated world? Even if it's in some ways preferable in some simple kind of clash of ideas or bloodshed amount lens. I don't think so. And I'm deeply worried about it, and I think you should be too. Even if it reduces bloodshed, the other kind of collateral damage, the silencing of minds, the erasure of dissent, the loss of people struggling towards justice and liberation, that damage would be enormous. And that kind of world, no matter how quiet or stable it seems, would not be a world full of good ideas. It's a fake utopia. It's Huxleyan. It's a dystopia. It's a place that gets called peaceful, but it was built through ethnic cleansing and censorship and silent repression and genocides and the erasure of dissent. It's peace by removal and neutering the quest for deeper forms of freedom and autonomy and dignity. And it can't be called flourishing, philosophically, ethically, spiritually. So the point is we need to take people's intentions seriously. Everyone has a story about what they believe and why they do what they do. Those beliefs and actions, though, interact in complex, very human ways, even within a single person, about stating their intentions versus what they do when they actually have the power to pull them off. I mean, just look at the leader of Syria now, for example, someone like Menachem Begin, for example. Intentions and power, both lenses are necessary to understand, predict, and try to be human, which I think we all are trying to be. So, there you go. There's a lot on my mind, and if you made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. And there are plenty of specifics that I mentioned that need more time and attention that I glossed over. But I think that I'll illuminate with some of the guests I have that will come back to this essay that I mentioned. So we're going to be learning more together about neoliberalism and the history of things like Marxist feminists in Oman, because how awesome is that? And petrochemicals and maybe the hopes of cryptocurrencies and more conversations on liberation and all of its forms. I think they're the coolest conversations. I think it's exciting stuff. And I really just want to be here as helpful and an open voice for anyone, as I can be, who finds the ramp or the off-ramp, because I think in the times we live in, there are going to be a lot more of us. And so thank you, and I'll see you in a few more days with a conversation with Scott Horton. Thanks.